Right, so this here is my R9 290X that I just picked up off eBay for about 20 quid. Now, this is something people have been requesting for years, but because I made a video somewhat recently on the GTX 970, loads of people were still saying this is a good, cheap alternative. So why don't we get this open, find out what we've actually got, and see if everyone that was telling me that the AMD option is better are maybe onto something, because if anything, these are still cheaper. In here should be our 290. How very controversial. It has arrived in EVGA anti-static paper, which is what my GTX 970 was. It's also worth noting, this is from a buy it now option. I didn't have to hang about for auctions, this was just straight up listed for about 20 quid. And it is the big lad. It is the full reference R9 290X. And it looks remarkably original. If this is still running the original thermal paste, I'm a tad scared. So there we go, this isn't a 290X, sorry, this is the R9 290, and it's the 4GB model, so you can get these for about 20 quid. As I said, this looks very original, like it's just been taken out of someone's computer, because none of the screws look touched, and there's quite a bit of dust. So I'm guessing this thing probably hasn't been cleaned, and these things apparently run hot and loud. Let's see if this AMD alternative is everything people have been telling me it would be. We'll just double check it works, but we will need modified drivers because of course these are out of driver support. The Nvidia alternatives are actually still supported, but we have got a signal, so all looks well. Now of course with these cars like the R9 290, they are out of driver support entirely. There's no security, there's nothing like that. Fortunately there are modified drivers, so if we have the GCN drivers here, we should just be able to get these installed. These are a bit more up to date. You do get a bit of extra performance. Kernel 2110. That will go through and that will put the latest drivers available on here. And at least that means that we should be able to run some more modern stuff. We are probably going to have to look into undervolting. I've never dabbled with the R9 290, so I'm quite curious to see if we can bring down that power draw slightly, because I think there's an efficient card in there somewhere, but I think this was the start of AMD throwing power consumption out the window to try and match what Nvidia was doing. And considering they were up against Maxwell and then Pascal afterwards, it's no surprise that this is what they resorted to. But for the money, this was quite a lot of card back in the day. But still, we'll get the drivers installed, make sure it works, and then we will start trying to do some undervolting. But we'll do a benchmark on it first. So it has installed with the modded drivers. It is saying it's an R9 290X. It's not. It is just a normal standard R9 290. You do get quite the amount of specifications. 2,560 unified shaders, 64 ROPs, 160 TMUs. Oddly enough, it specifies the sub-vendor as ATI add-in board. I mean, it's power color, but it's odd that it's calling itself an ATI. And architecturally, this should deal with the modern world pretty well. It deals with DirectX 12, it deals with Vulkan, but I have never had the chance to test one. Still, we're going to make sure this unit isn't overheating. We're just going to start off with a bit of Time Spy, just to get a baseline score, because apparently these things can sound like a Hoover. Performance is starting off pretty strong. I mean, it's in and around an RX 480 or a GTX 1060, and given those have shot up in price in recent months, I mean, for 20 quid to be able to match that level of performance, not too bad. Okay, fan's kicking in a little bit now. That is the profile these have out of the box. The fan is silent, it hits about 94 degrees, fan goes on full blast. And then, yeah, okay, the stories are true. It does want to sit at the mid-90s. Well, good to know it works, because that is just the way these are. At 94 degrees at its peak, that's when the fan kicks in. Clocks do suffer though, yeah, it does start down clocking slightly, but other than that, it's not thermally throttling like crazy. That is just how these operate. So let's see if we can fix that through the drivers, because I don't think that's any... Oh, that's so hot. That is ridiculously hot. So inside the Radeon drivers, we should be able to hopefully just do a lazy undervolt and fix this. So power tuning, we want to increase the power limit. Ridiculous, I know. GPU tuning, we want to see what voltage control we've got. And yes, that is a lot of voltage. So we're going to try 1181 by copying this power state here and just pasting that all across the board. Try and bring that voltage usage down. And when it comes to fan tuning, that's 4,000 RPM. What does max RPM sound like? Performance hasn't really changed, which is good to see. Temperatures are looking much better, now in and around 60 degrees, but we will let it run through and see if that Lazy Undervolt is enough to stop the throttling and stop the temperatures going crazy. And the best example I can give is we now hover between 70 to 80 degrees, where previously we were hitting 90 to 100 degrees and throttling. So this is a better setup, even if it is obnoxiously annoying. The room is getting almost uninhabitably hot, but that is now much better performance. We're now past the curve into where the good performance is. Anyone over past us will be overclocking, but how are we looking now? Yep, frequencies are perfect and temperatures top out at 81 degrees at their very peak. So yeah, really easy to fix an R9 290. It's still gonna run hot. That is just, the amount of heat that's chucking out is ridiculous. So this is what it's meant to all be about with the R9 290. You deal with the hindrance, but you get something that's cheap, and it's got plenty of power. So we've got GTA 5 Enhanced Edition here running with, I believe, maxed out pretty much. So yeah, TAA, very, very high, ultra, 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 everything pretty much on high or ultra. And let's see what kind of performance you get for 20 quid. It runs perfectly fine at nearly 60 frames per second. Yep, so the R9 290, this is kind of the thing that it had going for it. It does underperform in certain benchmarks, I've noticed, but when you throw it up into the real-world modern-day gaming scenarios, it is still an absolute powerhouse. And I'm not going to take away from the fact that the GTX 970 we tested recently was a great card, but these are cheaper. I've seen these go from 10 to 20 pounds. And that's not always auctions or deals. That's just people listing them as buy it now. Because let's be honest, it is a bit of a niche. To power this, you are going to need, well, quite an expensive power supply. So why are you looking at 20 quid R9 290s unless you wasted your entire budget? But then maybe your graphics card's broken and you just need something to get you by for a pinch, because prices, as we know right now, are absolutely ridiculous. Could this be the solution? I mean, I'm having to almost shout over the fan, and it's a heat wave here right now, and this is now the hottest room in the house, hotter than it is outside. Yeah, I can't really fault the performance I'm seeing from the 290. It's not a great out-of-box experience, but if you don't care about that, it does work. Yeah, honestly, this looks fantastic. It is so smooth. Anyway, I'm sure we'll do some power consumption testing later and see just how low on power consumption we can get this, because one of people's favorite points of all of these old AMD videos, or even Nvidia videos, is what kind of performance can you get out of these if you try and get their power envelope down, say, 50 to 100 watts, where suddenly this might seem a bit more viable. Anyway, gaming performance is excellent. So why don't we carry on with the rest of the video? It's now the following morning, and as much as I was going to carry on from here and just leave the card as is, because it's not thermally throttling anymore, after one night downloading things at the desktop, it is hitting 74 degrees with this original fan curve. I'm going to try repasting it. We're going to see if that helps at all, but I do think that is just how these things run. So after gently prying up from the corner, back and forth for a little bit, it is up. And it looks not too bad, to be honest. The thermal paste has turned to putty, to be honest. So yeah, this was thermal paste. The R9 290 gets hot enough that it will turn it back into blue tack. Yeah, you know what? I don't think anyone's ever been in here, so I'm surprised it's been working as well as it has for this long. Amazing to come across an R9 290 that's not been apart that is still functional. We'll get the actual results at the end, but yeah, I mean, it wasn't throttling before, but now it is a little bit quieter while it's running. I mean, it's still noisy, but at the same time, this does appear to have at least brought our temperatures down to the same range they were before, but with a quieter fan. Thermals are now slightly better. It tops out at 83 degrees, which is about what it was doing before at the end of a stress test, and it is now much quieter. So it's still noisy compared to virtually all other cards. It's now not unbearable. It's quieter than a GTX 480 under full blast. So to recap, to get these things sorted, if you're buying on the cheaper end of the market, which is the only area of the market these make sense, you are going to have to undervolt it, which takes all of 2 seconds, and repaste it, which takes about half an hour, and then you're going to have to run modified drivers. Once you've done all that though, you have a lot of power for just 20 quid. So once again, it is just that GCN thing. we're at the point now where they are solid cards, but they aren't just the plug-and-play beasts of their Nvidia counterparts. Which might be controversial to some people, but that's really just the way it is. So, just what are the full specifications of a Radeon R9 290? Well, on paper, it is actually quite a powerful card, being based on GCN2, namely the Hawaii Pro 28nm variant. You do get 4GB of GDDR5 memory, which isn't exactly a huge deal in 2026 standards, but it's still enough to get by usually, and this is all run through a huge 512-bit memory bus. Drivers are unfortunately completely out of date, however modified ones do go up to a date of 2023, provided using the modified NEMES or RDNID drivers. They're both one in the same. The cores, you get 2560, TMUs 160 and ROPs 64, so once again, it is a powerhouse in terms of out-and-out power. You do get a decent chunk of DirectX 12 and Vulkan support, but this all comes with one big cost, and it's not the price, it's the power consumption. Out of the box, this thing can use up to 275 watts in a stress test, and 200 watts while you're just gaming. In fact, undervolting still brings it in and around this figure, but don't worry, there is more on that later. In terms of price though, there is a reason why these are cheap, and that's because of that power consumption and the fact they're out of support, meaning that you can pick these up for £15 to £30 depending on the variant you're going for. If you don't mind a reference design like this today, I've seen them sell for as cheap as £10 over on eBay, provided you don't mind taking a chance on one that might not work. And it really is weird that we're back talking about the R9 290. I mean, this is what it was when the RX 480 and the GTX 1060 came out. People were still talking about the 290 and the GTX 970 because they were cheaper options. And now the RX 480 and 580 and the GTX 1060 seem to have doubled in price this year. It means that we are once again talking about their sort of higher-end predecessors. The only thing is though, being a higher-end AMD card of this era, you will need to do some modifications to get this to where you want it to be. Namely, you'll want to undervolt it at minimum, because this raised our time spy score by around 100 points, as well as bringing thermals down and stopping throttling. If you want to go a step further, which really you should on an R9 290 because these are very heavy and hot cards, you will benefit from cleaning it, because with the same undervolted settings and a quick clean, we gained a yet another 20 points. So really, if you are getting one of these cards, it's not a quick plug and play experience like the Nvidia counterparts, the GTX 970 comes to mind. You really do want to do your tweaking to get the performance out of this. Once you do though, it performs remarkably well. When we look at a progression through 3D Mark benchmarks, DirectX 10 and DirectX 11 performance are excellent, and entering the world of DirectX 12 with Time Spy and Steel Nomad, we can see entry-level titles that are quite reminiscent of optimized titles today should work perfectly fine, and Steel Nomad, quite reminiscent of the more bloated titles out there, are going to begin to struggle. When you remove CloudGate, which for some reason I have no idea what it is with some of these AMD cards, they perform exceptionally well in DirectX 10, probably because they aren't just brute forcing their way through things, which lines up with older rendering techniques. You can see the progression from DirectX 11 and Firestrike, a launch sort of benchmark for this card, through to Steel Nomad, and it's quite a nice linear curve. When you do begin to compare the R9 290, it's a few hundred points behind a GTX 970, and then a few more hundred points behind things like the 1060 and the RX 580. It makes sense, that's sort of where the R9 290's always been. However, I didn't expect the 970 to have this much of a lead in a DirectX 12 benchmark, because when you actually go back and look at Firestrike, they are much closer together in DirectX 11. Doesn't really make much sense, but you do have to consider that this is an overclock 970 it's up against, and it's coming pretty close in something that AMD was never particularly good at compared to its Nvidia counterparts, but it goes to show just how much raw power the 290 has that it's actually getting that close. So on paper, this is a good card, and yes, it's out of driver support, but given how much power you're getting in a cheap package, it should be able to do quite a lot of modern gaming, but I've never personally looked at the R9 290, because they held their value really well, and it's only now where they are firmly in the bargain bin, and it isn't seeing its prices go up like the GTX 970 has slightly, and more so like the RX 580 and GTX 1060 have done. I mean, they've more or less doubled in price. I think over on CEX, an RX 580 is now a £50 to £70 card, which is ridiculous.
So is the R9 once again the solution as an alternative to these, well, rather good mid-range cards? So we are benchmarking today with the Ryzen 7 3700X, 32GB of DDR4 RAM, more than enough power to ensure that the only bottleneck of the system is the R9 because people have been asking me for years to look at this card, and in particular since I made that GTX 970 video, they want to, well, a lot of people saying that this is the alternative to have. But I don't know how it's going to fare, because you got to remember, it's Nvidia competition, that's still in driver support. This 290, well, GCN's been brute forcing it for a few years now, but there's only one way to find out how it's going to do, and that's with the benchmarks. Now, starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which defaulted to Ultra settings, which is already very impressive, but we've already seen this slightly earlier on in the beginning. But in terms of actual frame rate, now the card is cleaned and undervolted and all set up ready for use, just how does it perform on an R9 290? Well, given the cost of these graphics cards is usually under 20 quid, you can't really argue with the amount of power on tap. With these settings, we returned 52 FPS on average, and 1% lows that were incredibly stable down to just 46 frames per second. The only thing that really had a major effect on the frame rate was when there was loads of grass on screen, which would bring you closer to that 46 FPS mark, but generally it ran really fine. If you dropped a few of these settings down, I don't doubt a constant 60 FPS would be on the table, and even when you move over to the world of online, yes, we see a slight hit to the overall average, now down to 47 FPS, the 1% lows also suffer a similar amount, now down to 39 FPS, but it never takes away from it being playable. So in terms of out-and-out performance, it's holding up pretty well for GTA Enhanced. Not that I really want to focus on legacy titles too much, because let's be honest, there have been plenty of videos made on the R9 290, and this is about the performance of the card available today. But just as a refresher, GTA 5 Legacy is a great title to show you the amount of power you had on tap back in the day. With Ultra settings, so that's all of the extra options turned on, plus AMD CHS shadows in a 1080p resolution, we returned 68 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 61 FPS. So you've got to keep in mind, if you had this graphics card available to you and you were using it when GTA 5 came out, then you were in a great situation. You weren't going to run into any problems. You're talking Ultra settings at 60 FPS, and that's exactly what games of this era were targeting. They were targeting cards like the R9 290, and with that raw brute force power, it's still getting through it today. Because of this brute force power though, it does mean in the rather less optimized GTA Online Legacy, we saw utilization fall quite a bit, and the temperatures dropped a little bit too because of this, but our frame rate actually stayed above 60 frames per second in a packed out lobby, which for those of you that have seen GTA Online Legacy benchmarks in any of the recent years, know that this is a bit of an anomaly, and the only reason for this is nothing to do with drivers, nothing to do with fancy techniques, it is purely the fact this card has so much raw, untapped power that it doesn't actually dent the frame rate when utilization isn't that high. In terms of cards to play Counter-Strike 2 on this segment of the market, where, 20 quid is a bit of a difficult region to say, you know what, I'm going to get into playing Counter-Strike 2 competitively on a budget, but it does appear the R9 290 doesn't do half bad of a job. With competitive settings in 1080p through the built-in workshop benchmark, we returned 178 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 142 FPS, which honestly, on its own in a 1080p resolution, is a decently playable experience. However, for people looking to get even more frame rate and play in the very popular 1280 by 960 resolution, you can see your average frame rate increase now up to 238. Smokes, effects and flames would of course bring dips to the frame rate, leading to our 1% lows of 168 frames per second, but overall it did feel noticeably smoother in this resolution. However, not all is smooth sailing for the R9 290. See, pretty much any of the older maps, anything up to about Nuke, will work fine on the card with no problems. But for some reason, I'm going to say it's probably VRAM related or possibly drivers, when you load into the latest release of Cache, it gets a 128 FPS average, but 1% lows are remarkably low, being at 79 frames per second. And that's because there was this momentary hitching, which never goes away. See, usually on these GCN cards, once you played a couple of rounds and you've actually not changed graphics card for a while, The thing is though, on cache, it never actually disappeared. This was almost a constant, and I played through an entire offline competitive match to try and simulate what it would be like. I tried going into an online match, and yeah, that hitching is always there, but only on these newer and more intensive maps. For the simpler ones, it's fine, but on cache, I don't know what's going wrong, it just didn't seem to want to work properly. In more optimistic news though, newer titles than Counter-Strike, like Arc Raiders, will work perfectly fine, and they work fine for a couple of reasons. Once you get through all of the driver warnings, which is a commonplace thing on GCN these days, it launches up and it works fine, and will default to low and medium settings in 1080p. Conveniently, you do actually have enough VRAM available that it's not just going to load in blobby textures, you will actually be able to see what you're doing, but these cards do respond decently well to FSR. No, they don't respond to it as well as the Nvidia counterparts, which is something that makes no sense, but then again, those cards are still in driver support. But that doesn't take away from the fact that with FSR 3 set to balance mode, which actually looks pretty good in this implementation, we returned 65 FPS on average, with really solid 1% lows down to 56 FPS. And that is something I have been noticing across most of the benchmarks so far, outside that weird anomaly in cache in Counter-Strike. The frame times here are really good for what this card is. So Arc Raiders is pretty much a 60 FPS experience with no problems, textures don't struggle to load in, and there was no crashes or stutters or problems, so Arc Raiders, no problems here. With Cyberpunk, we were able to run the game with high settings and low textures, and this involved utilising a 1080p resolution with FSR 3 also set to the balance mode. FSR 3 does work rather well on these cards, and to be fair, Cyberpunk is another one of those implementations where it actually looks pretty good. And how did this result in terms of an actual gameplay experience? Well, an average of 44 frames per second, 1% lows down to 36 frames per second. All in all, what I'd probably do is turn up a few more settings even further, or maybe turn FSR up to quality mode, and cap the game at 30 frames per second. Yes, you could lower things down a little bit if you were interested in getting a locked 60 FPS experience, but it can be a little bit wonky on these R9 290s. It can manage it though. But still, Cyberpunk was a really good showing, and even when things get really intensive, it sort of just brute forces its way through it and never went under that 30 FPS range. So Cyberpunk 2077, you can play it with really good settings on a under £20 graphics card, which seems ridiculous that we've reached this point already. However, it isn't all smooth sailing for the R9 290, because once again it meets its match in the world of Oblivion Remastered, which is a really good representation of the modern world of Unreal Engine 5 titles, where there is little to no VRAM management, and having under 4GB, or 4GB in this case, is pretty much a death sentence. With low settings and FXAA in 540p, we were able to eke out a 30 FPS experience, with the occasional stutter going on here or there, which led to 1% lows of 24 frames per second. And this really is such a great contrast to the previous two titles, where Arc Raiders, an optimized Unreal Engine 5 title, or Cyberpunk 2077, a Red Engine title, can look that good and run that well. But on the other end of the spectrum, with the bloated mess of titles, which isn't every Unreal Engine 5 title, but is some of them, you are looking at a sub-high definition resolution with in and around 30 frames per second just to get it playable, at which point, just play Oblivion without the remaster. Always a popular title with BeamNG, which we ran with the medium preset, which includes a mixture of medium and high settings. We also ran this through the jungle map with the traffic enabled, just to put some load on the card and try and fill up that VRAM pool, and all this was in a 1080p resolution. Now, the Vulkan render mode wouldn't work here, so we were forced to use DirectX 11, which isn't really a problem in titles like this on the R9 290, and we still returned an average of 56 frames per second, with 1% lows down to 49 FPS. Honestly, if you were in simpler maps or didn't have the traffic enabled, you could get a similar frame rate to this with even higher settings, but given this is for the sake of gameplay, it makes sense to keep the jungle map there, and of course the traffic enabled. So BeamNG, even in these more intensive scenarios, works perfectly fine on the R9 290. Although it did put a lot of load on the card, and you could tell by the way the fans wanted to ramp up that this was really taking full advantage of the power on display, probably because the sheer amount of draw calls and the fact we are using the older DirectX 11 version. There are certain instances where the R9 290 falls completely flat on its face, and Baldurs Gate 3 is one of them. The settings don't really matter because utilization of the card just falls apart completely. With medium settings and DirectX 11, which is something we have to use because the Vulkan render option doesn't work too well on these GCN cards and results in constant crashes, then we are forced into an experience that is probably okay if you capped it at 30 frames per second, but when you compare it to its Nvidia competition at similar price points in the market, it really isn't a good showing for the R9 290. Don't be wrong, it was controllable, especially with the type of game this is at 38 frames per second, but 1% lows down to 22 FPS, well, they indicate the stuttering that just wouldn't go away, which is something we've seen on pretty much all cards that are prior to the RX 480 and RX 580 from AMD. It just really struggles here, they never got the driver side optimizations, and it goes to show when you actually look at the gameplay figures. So Baldur's Gate 3 is playable, but not exactly an ideal experience. If you are looking for a cheaper graphics card to whack into a system to play Fortnite, then the R9 290 does a really good job. Given that DirectX 12 is now the default rendering choice for Fortnite, it means that when you launch it on a card like this, you do get some really solid and really stable performance, and we were running it with the performance mode and medium options enabled in a 1080p resolution. And how exactly did it run? Well, flawlessly, with 187 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 156 frames per second. Really, if you cap this at 144 FPS, you're very unlikely to see a single frame drop whatsoever, and it'll probably give the card a little bit of headroom to bring down the temperatures, which is something that you might want to consider. It'd also bring down the power consumption as well. Still, Fortnite works perfectly fine on the R9 290, and was honestly a really good showing for the card. Unfortunately, on the other hand, with PUBG, it really didn't matter what settings we were using. I benchmarked with low and medium to try and push a higher frame rate, and we went with the DirectX 12 render option, which usually on these GCN cards, it'll cap the frame rate at 60 FPS, but it's usually a really consistent frame rate. For some reason though, on the R9 290, that wasn't the case whatsoever. We were able to achieve a 55 FPS average with 1% lows down to 31, but that's because there was this constant hitching, and it wasn't related to VRAM, it wasn't even really related to our utilization. The only thing I can assume is that PUBG has now been updated a step further than GCN can manage on DirectX 12, and for a lot of those newer cards that can benefit from this, it's probably great. But the thing is, DirectX 12 has sort of been a saviour on these GCN cards. A lot of these older cards from AMD have really benefited from this mode. However, you could eke back some performance if you moved over to DirectX 11.1, which seems counterintuitive to how these cards work, but it did result in a very similar average of now 59 frames per second, and 1% lows now at 52 frames per second, with a 60 FPS cap in place. This is purely to actually keep the frame rate somewhat stable, because without this cap in place, it would be a little bit all over the place. But yeah, bit of a weird one from PUBG that we're now seeing better performance with DirectX 11.1 than we used to see on DirectX 12, and this has got to be caused by an update at some point, because this is, well, it goes against every old GCN benchmark we've done for the last 2-3 years. One of the most beautifully optimized titles of recent years with M&B Bannerlord, which seems to run on absolutely every graphics card under the sun, with a configuration pretty much ready to go from the moment you hit play. The game defaulted to very high settings in 1080p, makes sense, this card has a lot of power, and it returned 56 FPS throughout the built-in benchmark. 1% lows were really solid with 41 FPS, and the game stayed over 30 FPS even when things got rather intensive. It's worth keeping in mind the built-in benchmark is reminiscent of a battle in the late game, and has a lot of draw calls where it really zooms in on the battle, so for a lot of the early to mid-game, you're going to be seeing well over 60 FPS with these settings. So M&B Bannerlord, not really any problems there. There was a 60 FPS cap set by the game, or 75 FPS cap set by the game, which it didn't really need. You could get rid of that because we wouldn't see too much over that. But then again, for the early to mid game, you're just sort of wasting power throwing it away. So M&B Bannerlord works perfectly fine, but is that any surprise given how well optimized this title is and how powerful the R9 290 can be? Next up, with a very new and very popular title with Paralives, which we ran with low and medium settings in 1080p. Now unfortunately, once again, these settings didn't really matter too much to the R9 290 because this is it uses a heavily modified version of the Unity engine, which means that it is relying on driver-side optimizations to a certain degree, of which we have absolutely none available. It ran okay with 38 FPS on average, but 1% lows down to 22 FPS certainly felt a little bit stuttery in places. This would calm down eventually, and was mostly present when you loaded into a new lot and all of the assets were still being loaded in, and for the next sort of maybe 30 seconds to a minute, if you were utilizing speed up, it was a very stuttery experience. This would eventually go away though, leaving you with something that was between 30 to 60 FPS, depending on what was going on. Generally though, Paralives, it was playable. Resolution and setting doesn't really matter because at this stage the card is just brute forcing its way through, so it is impressive to see. But at the same time, your graphics card is going to be sounding like a hairdryer to produce the experience you're seeing on screen. I've included Red Dead Redemption 2 here just to sort of cover a certain point, because there was this little era of AMD fine wine. And it's about the sort of time Red Dead Redemption 2 came out when lots of games were pivoting towards DirectX 12 or Vulkan in their earlier implementations, and these cards still had a good degree of driver support for it, which resulted in cards like this R9 290 delivering spectacular performance and visuals on cards that really you wouldn't expect to do this, because they were so forward-thinking architecturally that they deal with these early DirectX 12 and Vulkan games with no problems, because the game defaults to high and ultra settings in 1080p and returns 39 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 34 FPS. When you were in larger, more built-up areas, it was close to that 30 FPS mark, and when you were outside in the wilderness, it was anywhere from 40 to around 60 FPS if it was actually quite quiet. But when you hear people talk about the power of the R9 290, this is what they're referring to. These earlier DirectX 12 and Vulkan titles, where there's still some optimizations from AMD, but ultimately the architecture of this card is just powering through it because it was so forward-thinking. And that's where sort of this warped perspective comes from of these cards still being great for the future, because there was a little period where the performance just sort of shot up for a few titles in and around this age. Fallout 4 Anniversary is always an interesting one to test because it's still very popular with people playing it, and we have seen it change performance metrics on a lot of these cards that would have dealt with the original release of Fallout 4. And how is the R9 290 dealing with it? Well, it's actually a smoother experience now than it used to be back in the day, as ultra settings in 1080p returned as 55 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 46 FPS. Generally, when you're outside or in smaller areas, you could see a locked 60 FPS experience, but combat and in built-up towns and cities would result in an experience that pretty much fluctuated between those two figures. It was between 40 to 55 FPS, but it wasn't a stuttery experience, it was a gradual slowdown that you weren't too inclined to notice. It's also worth noting that this graphics card does actually support FreeSync, so if you're playing it directly hooked up to the monitor, which I did play around with, you really can't actually notice the frame rate drops. So Fallout 4 Anniversary, it's a good example of how even on these brute force approaches like the R9 290, those anniversary updates have actually netted you a smoother experience that was less stuttery than the way it used to be. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? Well, with medium and high settings in 1080p, it runs it absolutely fine. High settings was unfortunately too much for the card to deal with unless you wanted to start dropping the resolution, as these settings are a little bit more VRAM hungry than the lower options, and would just result in an experience that was between 20 to maybe 35 frames per second. But if you drop a few of those options back to medium, you're looking at pretty much a constant 60 frames per second, with an average of 59 FPS and 1% lows down to 51. Anytime you weren't in combat or a built-up area, then it was running at a locked 60 frames per second, so I can't really argue with it, especially when you consider the visuals on display for a sub-£20 graphics card. And it's kind of a nice note to finish on, because it goes to show the R9 290 isn't perfect, but that brute force approach from AMD did let it produce some great visuals, provided you were going to tailor the game in and around what the card could actually do, because I mean, these visuals and these frame rates out of this card in something like Crysis Remastered, you can't scoff at it for the price these things are going for. So, overall performance of the R9 290, and it really does still go with the same approach it pretty much always has done, probably now more so than ever, because now it's so far out of driver support, it is nothing more than the sheer brute force power that is allowing the level of performance we've seen. Now, of course, there are a couple of fine wine standouts. GTA 5 Enhanced Edition and, of course, Red Dead Redemption 2 go on to show that the forward-thinking nature of GCN meant that there was a little resurgence in power for sort of those early 2020s titles when DirectX 12 and Vulkan were beginning to get adopted, and it is something the card does excel at. The problem is, in newer titles where you're completely outside driver support, it's often at times worse than the Nvidia equivalent, something that most people didn't see happening. Now, Maxwell, which is probably its main competitor on the used market, doesn't deal with DirectX 12 particularly well, it doesn't deal with Vulkan particularly well, but it does have driver updates, which mean that it does actually deal with the modern world in a slightly more compatible fashion, because, I mean, there's lots of titles that won't run on cards like this. You run something like Samson, it's going to struggle on Maxwell, but it won't even launch on these early GCN cards. It's probably got the power to eke out near in and around 30 FPS, probably with god-awful settings, but it probably could do it. But frankly, it doesn't even have the drivers to launch the game. And that is really the overall performance of the card. It is able to brute force it up to a certain point, and then suddenly it's not allowed to. Now, probably quite a few of you are looking at this and going, you know what, I don't mind dealing with these trade-offs. Sure, performance in newer titles is struggling because of drivers, but that brute force power just seems absolutely insane value for money. That is, of course, until you start looking at the power consumption of the R9 290. It is a very power-hungry card, and honestly, until I got the figures, which is a combination of reading what the card is reporting back and an at-the-wall figure, but this card can use 276 watts when running Furmark if you just let it run with its standard stock settings. Now, of course, undervolting this does make this a much more palatable 213 watt figure, and it's a similar story for gaming, where it's around 260 watts with its stock settings, but just under 200 watts when you are undervolting the card, and that's with the Lazy method that I showed you earlier. There's also another bit on there that we'll be getting to later with the Ultra Undervolt, but don't worry, we have thermals to talk about first. And in terms of thermals, with stock settings, this thing is unbelievably loud and will thermally throttle, reaching 98 degrees in Furmark at its peak, and in terms of gaming, it's still throttling, running at 96 degrees. Undervolting it doesn't look like it makes too much of a difference, but what I will tell you is it's no longer thermally throttling, and it no longer sounds like a jet engine. Genuinely, undervolting your card will be enough to make it bearable to be in the room with, and I cannot stress that the noise of this thing running at stock settings is deafening. When you undervolt it, it becomes bearable, but it's still going to run in around 90 degrees. If you push this even further with an Ultra Undervolt, the fan is a lot quieter, but it still runs toasty, because, of course, well, it's a toasty architecture, and it is a blower cooler. But what is that Ultra Undervolt we're on about? Well, this is one of my favourite bits of utility testing, at least that's how I refer to this section of the video, which is where we see just how power efficient a card can be by putting it down to the lowest power consumption figures we can manage while still getting passable performance. And to test this, I managed to undervolt the R9 290 to power consumption figures that were in and around 70 watts while running Furmark, which is very stressful on GCN, but at the same time, running in and around the 40 watt mark while gaming. That's right, Hawaii, at least the Hawaii version of the GCN architecture, can be ludicrously efficient if you are undervolting this to its near maximum, because we were able to play GTA 5 Enhanced Edition with the high preset at 60 frames per second, while this card used 40 watts. And was completely silent. You do lose quite a chunk of power, you won't be playing Cyberpunk with this type of undervolt. But at the same time, if you are looking at this as a budget card and you're thinking, well, I've got an okay power supply, but maybe it can't handle, this R9 290, well, at 20 quid, if you don't mind really power limiting it, dropping the clocks and dropping the voltages, it's actually really powerful for the power envelope it's using. It is just a case of this architecture was designed to try and push the high end, when in reality, if you are now looking at it as a cheap used option on the market, you might be better off running it with a 40 watt power envelope on some lower end system. Is this ideal? No, but at the same time, you can't really complain at the performance you're seeing with this level of power efficiency, and I couldn't believe we were getting this out of an R9 290, and it was silent! So yes, the R9 290 can be power efficient, but even if you're not chasing these mega undervolts, please just do the lazy undervolt I showed you how to do at the beginning of the video. So there we have it, the R9 290. Now I know a lot of people will be commenting, why aren't we testing on Linux today? Well, I did try and film an entire segment on this, but unfortunately my CachyOS install has decided it's completely balked and will not initialize any games whatsoever. I spent the weekend trying to troubleshoot it because this video is meant to go out on Friday, and look where we are today, it's Monday, and there was no dice. So I'm gonna completely nuke that install, reinstall it so we can bring back Linux testing to these videos. Maybe I'll do a small video out there where we just take a quick brief look at this over in the world of Linux, because there is one thing these cards do have going for them, is great Linux side support. So arguably any of the performance you've seen today should be matched or surpassed if you are running it over on Linux, something it does have against its Nvidia counterparts. But would I say to go and get an R9 290 in 2026? It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because the reason we've looked at this card is because we looked at the GTX 970. And because cards like the RX 480, RX 580 and the GTX 1060 have doubled in price to the stage where an RX 580 on CEX right now is £70. That's right, these things have shot up in price for some unknown reason, meaning that the original alternatives to these back when they launched, like the R9 290 or the GTX 970, are now fair game. But ultimately, for the average person, if you are looking for a cheap graphics card to get, I'm going to say go and get the Nvidia option. I've seen GTX 970s in this ballpark as well. We looked at it probably about a month ago now, and the out-of-the-box experience is just that much better. Now, if you don't mind tweaking it around or want to spend even less, the R9 290 is a great card. However, you are going to need to undervolt and clean it, most likely if you want to be able to use it properly, and even then power consumption is through the roof, at which stage you probably spent enough on your power supply that you could probably budget in something better. Now, if your graphics card's died and you just want something to get you by, there's nothing wrong with going with the R9 290. I've had no problems with it, and to be fair, for a lot of titles of its era, up to early DirectX 12 and Vulkan, it really is quite a cool card, because just the brute force power and stupidity of it. But if you use one of these out of the box, it's not going to be a fun time. You need modded drivers and you need an undervolt, otherwise you're going to have something that is incredibly unsupported and will sound like a jet engine. Anyway, it is a good performing card, but really, if you are looking at the world of eBay auctions, maybe find a GTX 970 because those are also going cheaper. And in modern titles, it'll surpass this. In titles of its era, it'll match it or surpass it, and it'll perform slightly worse in games in around the sort of early 2020s. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a great example, runs at 900p with similar settings on the 970, but runs at 1080p on the R9 290. Provided you can get past things like this, I do think the Nvidia card is a better bet. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed the video. People have been asking to see the R9 290 for years, and it's good that I decided to test it in a heatwave, because yeah, I could only do one benchmark and then I'd have to leave the room. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and good night.